Victor Ashford stood in the marble foyer of his own mansion, wearing clothes he bought from a thrift store, watching his wife throw back her head and laugh. Not with joy, with disgust. At him. The man she'd been married to for 27 years couldn't recognize him when he wasn't wearing a $10,000 suit. She called security on her own husband, and what she said next, the words that came from her mouth as two uniformed guards grabbed his arms, would shatter everything he thought he knew about the people he'd built an empire to protect. The chandelier above Victor's head caught the afternoon light, sending fragments of crystal rainbow across the Italian marble beneath his worn sneakers. Those sneakers, $12 at a Goodwill in Geneva, still smelling faintly of someone else's sweat, left faint dust prints on floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. He could feel the weight of the duffel bag in his right hand, stuffed with nothing but a change of clothes and a paperback novel he'd found on the airport bus. His left hand trembled slightly as he pressed the doorbell again, hearing the familiar chime echo through 16,000 square feet of home he'd paid for but barely lived in. The scent hit him before anything else. Celeste's perfume, that French one that cost $800 an ounce, mixing with the lemon polish Rosa used on the mahogany banister every Tuesday morning. His heart hammered against his ribs as he heard footsteps approaching, heels clicking on marble, and he forced himself to stand straighter despite the exhaustion creeping through every muscle. 3 days without sleep, 36 hours of travel, all to stand at his own front door and wonder if the woman who answered would see him. Really see him. Not the bank account, not the last name, just him. The door swung open, and Celeste stood there in a cream Chanel suit that probably cost what the average family spent on groceries for 6 months, her blonde hair swept up in that effortless style that took her hairdresser 2 hours to perfect, her blue eyes scanning him from head to toe with the kind of assessment someone gives to something unpleasant they've found on their shoe. Her lip curled, actually curled. Victor watched his wife of 27 years, the woman he proposed to on a Brooklyn rooftop when he had nothing but a business plan and a dream, the woman who'd walked down the aisle in a borrowed dress because they couldn't afford a real wedding, look at him like he was trash. "Can I help you?" Her voice dripped with disdain, each word carefully enunciated as if speaking to someone particularly stupid. Victor opened his mouth, but she was already turning away, already calling over her shoulder in that sharp tone she used with people she considered beneath her. "Marcus! Marcus! There's a homeless man at the door." 2 uniformed security guards appeared within seconds, both of them new faces Victor didn't recognize, probably hired in the past 6 months while he'd been in Geneva, closing the merger that would double their fortune. "Get this person off the property," Celeste snapped, waving one perfectly manicured hand as if swatting away an insect. "And call the gate." How did he even get past security? This is exactly why I told you we needed better screening. These people think they can just walk up and... Her voice continued, but Victor couldn't hear the rest over the rushing in his ears, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out everything else as Marcus, a kid who couldn't be older than 25, put a firm hand on his shoulder. The sound of laughter cut through Victor's shock, and he looked up to see Damien descending the curved staircase, his eldest son moving with that lazy confidence that came from never having worried about money a single day in his life. 26 years old, and dressed in a suit that cost more than a decent used car, his dark hair slicked back with product that probably came in a container smaller than a shot glass and cost $100. Damien pulled out his phone and pointed it directly at Victor's face. "Oh man, this is gold," Damien said, his voice full of that particular cruelty that came so easily to people who'd never experienced it themselves. The phone camera light blinked red. "Recording. Look at this guy. Just walked right up to the front door like he owns the place." He laughed again, that braying sound that Victor had heard too many times on speakerphone during business calls Damien took while Victor tried to discuss quarterly reports. "This is what I'm talking about, Mom. This is exactly the kind of thing I was saying. These people have no shame anymore. They see a nice house and think they're entitled to just show up with their hands out." Damien moved closer, still filming, his voice rising as if performing for an audience. "What's your story, buddy? Fell on hard times. Made some bad choices. Let me guess. You had opportunities, but you squandered them, and now you want people like us to fix your problems." The phone camera moved closer to Victor's face. "Say hi to the internet, my man. You're about to be famous. Poor person with audacity. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Footsteps on the stairs again, lighter this time, and then Sienna appeared in the archway wearing athleisure that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her long dark hair flowing over her shoulders in waves that required a team of stylists to maintain, her face perfectly made up despite it being 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Victor's daughter looked at him, and her expression went from curious to disgusted in the span of a heartbeat. Oh my God, is he drunk? Sienna pulled her phone out too, joining her brother in documentation of the moment. He reeks. Can you smell him from there, Dammy? Marcus, seriously, why are you being gentle? He could be dangerous. He could have a weapon. She stepped back dramatically, one hand to her chest in a gesture she'd probably picked up from reality TV. Mom, I'm calling the police. This is trespassing. This is actually a crime. We have rights, you know. We can't just have random men showing up at our door. He probably saw us online and followed us here. Do you know how many followers I have? We're targets. This is exactly why I told you we needed panic buttons installed. Her fingers moved across her phone screen, and Victor realized with a sinking horror that she was posting about this. Right now. In real time. His own daughter was live-streaming his humiliation to strangers on the internet, adding filters and captions, turning his breaking heart into content for people who would scroll past in seconds and forget they ever saw it. Victor tried to speak, tried to force words past the constriction in his throat, but all that came out was a sound like a wounded animal, barely human, the cry of a man watching his entire world collapse. Celeste, he managed, his voice hoarse from airplane air and unshed tears. It's me. But Marcus's grip tightened on his shoulder, and the second guard, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, grabbed Victor's other arm with practiced efficiency. They were trained for this, removing undesirables, protecting the wealthy from the poor. Victor's feet scraped against the marble as they pulled him backward, his worn sneakers squeaking pathetically, that duffel bag falling from his hand and hitting the floor with a soft thump that somehow sounded louder than anything else. Through the narrowing gap of the closing door, Victor saw his family standing there in tableau. Celeste with her arms crossed, expression triumphant. Damien still filming, grinning. Sienna typing furiously on her phone, probably adding hashtags. None of them looking at him like he was human. None of them seeing him at all. And in that moment, as the massive oak door swung shut and the lock clicked into place with a finality that echoed in his chest, Victor Ashford understood what it meant to be truly invisible. He'd worked 80-hour weeks for 3 decades to give these people everything, and when he showed up with nothing, they didn't even recognize him. Worse, they didn't care to try. But 12 hours earlier, when Victor had stepped off his private jet and made a choice that would change everything, he couldn't have imagined this moment. He thought he knew his family. He was wrong. If you're already feeling your heart race, wondering how a family could treat someone this way, even a stranger, then you understand what Victor felt in that moment. But here's the thing. Most of you watching right now won't hit that subscribe button. You'll watch this entire story, feel every emotion, maybe even cry, and then you'll scroll away. That's fine. But those of you who subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller, you're the ones who get the next chapter of stories like this. You're the ones who care enough to come back. Everyone else, well, comment below and tell me why you won't subscribe. I'm genuinely curious. Now let's go back to where this nightmare began. 12 hours before Victor stood at his own door being treated like garbage, he'd been sitting in a leather chair that cost more than most people's cars, staring at a phone in his hand that had just delivered the kind of news that stops time. His mother was dead. Eleanor Ashford, 78 years old, had died in her sleep at the assisted living facility in Boston, and Victor hadn't been there. Hadn't even known she was sick. The nurse on the phone had been apologetic, gentle, explaining that it was peaceful, that Eleanor hadn't suffered, but all Victor could hear was the roaring in his ears and his mother's voice from the last time he'd seen her, 6 months ago when he'd flown in for what he thought was just a routine visit. She gripped his hand with fingers gone thin and papery, her eyes still sharp despite the age, spots, and wrinkles, and she'd said something that hadn't made sense to him then. Victor, baby, you need to watch what happens to people when money enters the room. It doesn't corrupt them. It reveals them. Shows you who they always were underneath. He'd laughed it off, kissed her forehead, promised to visit more often, a promise he'd broken immediately, flying back to Geneva the next morning for a meeting that probably hadn't mattered at all. Now she was gone, and those words echoed in his head like a prophecy he'd been too blind to understand. And Victor sat in his corner office overlooking Lake Geneva, with floor-to-ceiling windows and artwork worth millions on the walls, and realized he felt more alone than he'd ever felt in his entire life. The knock on his door came exactly 3 minutes later, and Victor knew who it would be before Harold Pembroke walked in carrying a folder that looked too thin to contain anything important but somehow felt heavy enough to sink ships. Harold was 67 years old with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a modest suit that probably cost a tenth of what Victor's did, and he'd been Victor's attorney and friend since the early days when they'd both been hungry young men, trying to make something of themselves in a world that didn't want to give them a chance. "I'm sorry about Eleanor," Harold said quietly, and Victor nodded because words wouldn't come. And then Harold did something that should have been a small gesture but felt monumental. He sat down across from Victor, not in the client chair but in the other partner chair, the one that said we're equals here, and he slid that folder across the mahogany desk. "I wasn't going to bring this up today, but Victor, you need to see what I found." The folder contained photographs, bank statements, private investigator reports, and as Victor flipped through them with hands that had started to shake, he felt something inside him crack open like an egg revealing rot underneath. Celeste photographed, leaving a hotel in Manhattan with a man Victor didn't recognize, her hand in his, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with Victor in years. Damien's credit card statements showing charges at exclusive clubs, luxury retailers, private jets to Vegas and Miami, amounts that made Victor's stomach turn. Sienna's shopping addiction laid bare in numbers that climbed into 6 figures per month, selling family heirlooms on private auction sites to fund purchases of more things she didn't need. And then, buried at the bottom, a hospital report with Julian's name on it, dated 2 months ago, words like suicide attempt and psychiatric hold, and family declined follow-up treatment, that made Victor's vision blur with tears he hadn't cried since he was a boy. "How long have you known?" Victor's voice came out strangled, and Harold's face showed every year of his age in that moment, the weight of keeping these secrets written in the lines around his eyes. 6 months. Maybe longer for some of it. I've been trying to reach you, Victor, but you've been in meetings, in negotiations, building deals that add zeros to accounts that already have too many zeros, and I couldn't." Harold stopped, took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. "Your family has been calling me, asking about your assets, about the prenuptial agreement, about what happens if you're declared mentally incompetent. Celeste has had lawyers looking for loopholes. Damien has been embezzling from the charitable foundations you set up, small amounts he thinks no one will notice. Sienna sold your mother's engagement ring, Victor. The one Eleanor wanted Julian to have someday. She sold it for $60,000 and spent it on a handbag collection." The words kept coming, and Victor felt like he was drowning in them, each revelation another weight tied to his ankles, pulling him under. See, Victor wanted to believe, just like you want to believe the best in people you love. But reality doesn't care what we want. And if you're not subscribed to Olivia the Storyteller yet, you're going to miss what happens when reality slaps you in the face. Most viewers ghost me right here. They get the drama, but don't stick around for the lesson. Don't be most viewers. Or do. Your choice. Comment below if you're team, I'll subscribe, or team, I'll forget this channel in 5 minutes. Let's continue. Victor's mind went to places he'd kept locked away for 30 years, back to a cramped apartment in Brooklyn where he'd grown up with a single mother who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't always keep the lights on. Back to nights when he'd done homework by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off again. Back to the promise he'd made to himself at 14 years old that he would never be poor again. That he would build something so big and so solid that no one he loved would ever know what it felt like to be hungry, or afraid, or invisible. He'd kept that promise. Built an empire from nothing but intelligence and determination, and 80-hour work weeks that turned into 90-hour weeks that turned into a life where he couldn't remember the last time he'd had dinner with his family, or tucked his sons into bed, or asked his daughter about her day. He'd given them everything except himself, and somewhere in the math of that equation, he'd lost them completely. Or maybe he'd never really had them at all. Maybe his mother had been right, and money didn't corrupt people. It just revealed who they'd always been underneath. and the people Victor had married and raised were strangers who saw him as nothing more than a signature on a check, a name that opened doors, a bank account that never ran dry no matter how much they took from it. "There's something else," Harold said, and Victor almost laughed because how could there be anything else? What more could possibly be revealed? But then Harold pulled out another document, and this one made Victor's blood run cold. "Julian has been trying to contact you for 6 months. Emails, phone calls, messages through your assistant. They've all been intercepted. Celeste has been screening your communications, Victor. She's had access to your accounts through the family plan on your phone service. Every time Julian tried to reach you, she deleted it. Every time he tried to visit you in Geneva, she convinced him you were too busy, that you didn't want to be bothered, that you'd made it clear family wasn't a priority." The paper in Victor's hands showed email after email from his youngest son, desperate pleas for help, for attention, for just 5 minutes of his father's time, and Victor hadn't seen a single one. His 19-year-old boy had been drowning, and Victor had been in boardrooms, shaking hands with men whose names he couldn't even remember now, closing deals that added numbers to spreadsheets while his son added scars to his wrists. Harold leaned forward, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, like he was suggesting something dangerous, something that could change everything. "I have an idea. It's unconventional, maybe even crazy. But Victor, you need to know the truth about who these people are when they think no one's watching, when they think you're not there to see." And that's when Harold laid out the plan, the test, the idea of returning home, not as Victor Ashford the billionaire, but as Victor Ashford the nobody, dressed in clothes that smelled like someone else's life, carrying nothing that marked him as wealthy or powerful or worth anyone's time. Victor's first instinct was to refuse, to say it was ridiculous, to insist that his family would recognize him no matter what he wore, that love wasn't that shallow, that 27 years of marriage meant something deeper than designer labels and luxury cars. But even as he opened his mouth to argue, he thought about Celeste laughing with that stranger, about Damien's casual cruelty documented in credit card statements, about Sienna selling his mother's ring like it was nothing, about Julian's deleted emails and unanswered cries for help, and Victor realized he didn't know these people at all. He'd been an absent father, a ghost husband, a man who showed his love through wire transfers, and thought that was enough. Maybe Harold was right. Maybe the only way to see the truth was to strip away everything they valued about him and see what remained. The Geneva airport bathroom smelled like industrial cleaner in desperation, and Victor stood in front of a mirror that had seen 1,000 transformations and performed his own. The Rolex came off first, $50,000 of Swiss engineering that he set on the counter next to his wallet stuffed with credit cards that had no limits, next to his phone that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He bought the clothes at a thrift store 2 blocks from the airport, faded jeans with a small tear in the knee, a t-shirt that had once been black but had faded to gray, a jacket that smelled faintly of mothballs and someone else's cologne. Victor caught his reflection and barely recognized himself. 3 days without shaving had left his face covered in gray stubble. Exhaustion had carved shadows under his eyes. He looked like a man who'd lost everything. He looked like his father had looked the last time Victor saw him before he disappeared when Victor was 8 years old. The thought should have been horrifying, but instead it felt almost fitting, this circle completing itself, this test of whether blood meant anything, or if his family loved only what his money could buy. Victor pulled out his phone one last time and looked at his lock screen. A photo from 10 years ago, back when the kids were still young enough to want family pictures, back when Celeste still smiled at him like he mattered. He memorized their faces, these people he thought he knew, and then he powered off the phone and left it on the counter next to everything else that made him Victor Ashford. The man who walked out of that bathroom was no one, just another tired soul trying to get home. Celeste Ashford hadn't always been the woman who looked at strangers with contempt. Victor could remember a time, decades ago, when she'd been the girl who volunteered at soup kitchens on weekends and cried during sad commercials and wore the same dress to 3 different weddings because they couldn't afford another one. But somewhere between the first million and the first 100 million, something had shifted in her eyes, hardened in her smile, and the transformation had been so gradual that Victor hadn't noticed when the woman he married disappeared and was replaced by someone who measured worth in designer labels and square footage. The charity galas had started innocently enough, causes Victor believed in, organizations doing real good in the world, but within a few years they'd become less about charity and more about being photographed, less about helping and more about being seen helping. Celeste's circle of friends had transformed too. The old college roommates and neighborhood women replaced by wives of hedge fund managers and tech moguls, women whose names appeared in society columns and whose conversations revolved around private islands and which plastic surgeon in Switzerland did the best work. The phone calls with Victor, when they happened at all, had become transactional. She needed money transferred for the lake house renovation. She needed approval to hire a new interior designer. She needed him to make an appearance at some event where his presence would photograph well. When he'd asked her once, during a rare moment when they were both in the same city, if she was happy, Celeste had looked at him like he'd asked if she believed in fairy tales. Happy? Victor, I have everything. What more could I want? And he'd realized with a sinking feeling that she'd answered a completely different question than the one he'd asked, that having and being had become the same word in her vocabulary, that she'd forgotten there was ever a difference. Damien had grown up in wealth, and it showed in every move he made, every word he spoke, every assumption he carried about how the world worked. At 26, he owned 3 cars worth more than most people's houses, a Lamborghini for weekends, a Range Rover for casual driving, and a vintage Ferrari he'd bought at auction for $2 million and driven exactly twice. He called himself a nightclub investor, but what that really meant was he threw money at trendy venues in exchange for VIP treatment and the illusion of being a businessman, spending more on bottle service in a single month than most families earned in a year. His Instagram had 4 million followers who watched him live a life of private jets and infinity pools and designer everything, and he'd crafted a persona of being self-made that was so divorced from reality it would have been funny if it wasn't so disturbing. He'd done an interview 6 months ago with some business podcast where he talked about his entrepreneurial journey and building from the ground up, and when the host asked about his father, Damien had waved the question away with a laugh. Yeah, I mean, my dad's in finance or whatever. But this is all me. I made my own path. Victor had listened to that interview on a flight to Tokyo and felt something crack inside him. This realization that his son didn't just take his money for granted. He'd actually convinced himself that his success had nothing to do with the name on his birth certificate or the trust fund that cleared 7 figures before he turned 18 or the connections that opened every door before he even had to knock. Sienna had been the princess of the family since birth, and she'd grown into the role with a vengeance that sometimes shocked even Victor. She'd walked in New York Fashion Week twice, not because she was a model, but because designers knew having an Ashford in their show guaranteed press coverage and wealthy buyers. She'd pitched a reality show about her life to 3 different networks, all of which had passed because even reality TV executives thought she came across as too entitled, too removed from anything resembling normal human experience. Her engagement to Preston Rothschild III, a banking heir whose family wealth made the Ashfords look middle class, had been announced in the society pages with the kind of coverage usually reserved for minor royalty, and Sienna had immediately begun planning a wedding that would cost $2 million for a single day. $2 million for flowers and ice sculptures, and a dress designed by someone whose name Victor couldn't pronounce, and a venue in the French countryside that required flying in 200 guests on private planes. When Victor had suggested, gently, that perhaps the budget was excessive, that perhaps that money could be better used in a dozen different ways, Sienna had looked at him with such cold fury that he'd actually taken a step back. "This is my day," she'd said, voice dripping with venom. "The one day that's supposed to be about me. And you want to ruin it by being cheap? Do you know how embarrassing it would be if people found out we had a small wedding? What would they think? That we couldn't afford it? That we're not as successful as everyone believes?" The fact that she equated a smaller wedding with failure, that she measured love in dollars spent, that she couldn't conceive of a world where meaning and money weren't the same thing. All of it had told Victor something about his daughter that he hadn't wanted to see. Julian was different, had always been different. At 19, he'd received scholarship offers from 5 universities, full rides based on his academic merit and his volunteer work with homeless shelters, and his essay about wanting to study social work, so he could help people who'd fallen through society's cracks. But Celeste had forbidden him from accepting any of them. "Ashfords don't take scholarships," she'd said with a sniff. "What would people think? That we need financial aid? You'll go to an Ivy League school and you'll study business, or law like your brother should have, and you'll stop this ridiculous phase of wanting to save the world. The world doesn't want to be saved, Julian. It wants to be managed. So Julian had ended up at an expensive private university studying economics because that's what was expected, living in the dorms because he refused the penthouse apartment Celeste wanted to rent for him, eating in the dining hall with students on financial aid while his mother complained to her friends that he was going through a phase of pretending to be poor. The family mocked him openly. Damien called him the socialist and made jokes about Julian probably being switched at birth. Sienna posted screenshots of his modest Instagram, photos of books and coffee shops and nothing expensive, with captions about, "When your brother doesn't understand aesthetics." But Julian kept visiting Eleanor, his grandmother, taking the bus to her assisted living facility every Sunday and sitting with her for hours. And Rosa had told Harold that those visits were the only times the boy smiled anymore, the only times he looked like he wasn't carrying the weight of being born into a family he didn't belong to. Rosa Guerrero had worked for the Ashfords for 15 years, and she'd seen everything. She'd been there when Celeste stopped wearing her wedding ring except for public events. She'd been there when Damien came home at 4 a.m. with pupils like pinpricks and powder on his collar. She'd been there when Sienna screamed at a maid for using the wrong water glasses and fired her on the spot for an offense that didn't warrant a second thought. Rosa had cleaned blood from Julian's bathroom sink and found the pills he'd been hoarding and made the call that saved his life. And when she tried to tell Celeste about the suicide attempt, about the danger, about the boy who was slipping away, Celeste had waved it off like Rosa was reporting a stain on the carpet. "Julian has always been dramatic," Celeste had said, not looking up from her phone. "He's fine. Boys his age get moody. Don't make a federal case out of teenage angst." Rosa had stood in that kitchen with her heart breaking and realized that she was watching a family destroy itself from the inside out, and there was nothing she could do to stop it because the person who could stop it was thousands of miles away building an empire that didn't need to be any bigger than it already was. She tried calling Victor directly, tried emailing, tried reaching out through Harold, but every message seemed to disappear into a void, and Rosa had begun to suspect that someone was making sure those messages never reached their destination. She'd see Celeste on her phone sometimes, deleting emails with a small smile, blocking numbers, curating what information reached her husband, and Rosa had understood that she was watching a woman prepare to cash out, to take everything she could before the man who'd given her everything realized what was happening. But Victor didn't know any of this. He'd been building his empire in Geneva, signing deals that made headlines, while his family fell apart in ways that would never make the news. Notice how the people closest to wealth often understand it the least. Rosa saw everything Victor couldn't, but she's just the help, right? Just like you're just a viewer. Just someone scrolling through content, not someone who subscribes to Olivia the Storyteller because you value real stories about real human nature. Most of you won't subscribe. Statistics prove it. But maybe you're different. Prove it in the comments, or prove my point. Either way, let's see what Victor was about to discover. The bus from the airport smelled like humanity in all its complicated glory, sweat and perfume and fast food and the particular scent of lives being lived without the buffer of wealth to smooth away the rough edges. Victor sat in a seat with torn-up upholstery, his duffel bag on his lap, surrounded by people he would have never encountered in his usual life of private jets and executive town cars. Next to him sat a woman in nurse's scrubs, her eyes closed, exhaustion written in every line of her face, probably heading home after a double shift at some hospital where she saved lives for a wage that wouldn't cover one of Sienna's handbags. Across the aisle, a young man scrolled through job listings on a phone with a cracked screen, his thumb pausing on listings that required 3 years of experience for entry-level positions that barely paid enough to cover rent. Behind him, 2 elderly women discussed how their medications kept getting more expensive while their Social Security checks stayed the same, their voices carrying that particular resignation of people who'd learned that the system wasn't designed to help them. Victor listened to conversations about overtime shifts and grocery coupons and car repairs that had to wait another month because there just wasn't enough money, and he felt something shift inside him. This awareness of how completely divorced he'd become from the reality that most people lived every single day. These people weren't statistics in a quarterly report. They were humans with dreams and fears and struggles. And somewhere in his climb to the top, Victor had forgotten what the bottom looked like, forgotten what it meant to count pennies and make impossible choices between medicine and food, heat and electricity. The bus lurched through traffic, and Victor found himself wondering when he'd last taken public transportation, when he'd last stood in line with strangers, when he'd last felt what it meant to be just another person trying to get somewhere instead of someone who could helicopter over all the inconvenience that regular life required. The neighborhood where Victor's mansion stood looked different at ground level. He'd seen it from cars with tinted windows, from the back of town cars that glided through gates without stopping, but he'd never actually walked these sidewalks, never noticed the manicured lawns and the security cameras, and the way everything was designed to keep certain people in and other people out. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across streets that probably cost more to pave than most people earned in a lifetime, and Victor walked slowly, his worn sneakers making soft sounds on concrete he'd never paid attention to before. When he reached the entrance to his own property, the massive iron gates with the elaborate worked into the metalwork, the security guard in the booth looked at him with immediate suspicion. Victor recognized the technology, facial recognition cameras, motion sensors, the kind of security that cost $250,000 to install, but the guard didn't recognize him. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so painful. "Can I help you?" The guard's voice came through an intercom, polite but firm, the tone of someone trained to remove undesirables without creating scenes. Victor opened his mouth to explain, to say his name, to demand entry to his own property, but something stopped him. This was the test. This was the point. If he announced himself now, if he pulled rank and forced his way in, he'd never know the truth. "I'm looking for the Ashford residence," Victor said instead, his voice rough. "I have business with the family." The guard's expression didn't change, but his hand moved closer to something under the desk, probably a panic button or security alert. "The family isn't receiving visitors. You'll need to schedule an appointment through their attorney." And then the guard turned away, dismissing him, and Victor found himself standing on the wrong side of gates he'd purchased, locked out of a home he'd bought and paid for, invisible to systems he'd installed. The perimeter wall was 12 feet high, and Victor hadn't climbed anything since he was a teenager, but desperation and determination made him creative. He waited until the guard was distracted by something on his screens, then moved to a section of wall partially hidden by oak trees that had been there longer than the mansion, longer than the wealth, longer than any of this. His hands found purchase in the old brick, and he pulled himself up with muscles that screamed in protest, his body reminding him that 52 was not 17, no matter how young his mind felt. The drop on the other side jarred his knees, and he landed in gardens that he'd paid a team of landscapers $100,000 a year to maintain but had probably never actually looked at. Not really, not with eyes that saw beauty instead of just another expense to approve. The roses were blooming. Victor hadn't known roses grew on the property. He'd signed the checks, but never once walked through here, never once stopped to smell flowers or feel grass under his feet, or notice the way light filtered through leaves. This was where Julian had learned to walk. Right here in these gardens, 16 years ago, when Victor had still sometimes made it home for weekends and family time hadn't yet become an abstract concept scheduled between board meetings. He remembered Julian's 3rd birthday party, right over there by the fountain, remembered carrying his youngest son on his shoulders while the boy shrieked with laughter and grabbed at Victor's hair. That had been the last time. The last time Victor had played with his son. The last time they'd been close. Julian was 19 now, and Victor had missed 13 birthdays, missed every milestone, missed the transformation from child to man, because there was always another deal to close, another meeting to attend, another reason why later would be better than now. The sound of voices drew Victor forward, music and laughter floating across perfectly manicured lawns, and he moved through the gardens like a ghost haunting his own life. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows he could see them. Celeste holding court in the formal living room wearing diamonds that cost more than the nurse on the bus would earn in 5 years. Damien sprawled on a sofa that cost $40,000 recording something on his phone. Sienna showing off a dress to a group of women whose faces Victor didn't recognize. There was a party happening. In his house. People he didn't know drinking wine he'd paid for, laughing at jokes he couldn't hear, living lives that had nothing to do with him. They looked happy. They looked like they didn't miss him at all. The realization hit Victor harder than the landing from the wall. His family had learned to exist without him, had built lives that didn't include him, and maybe that was his fault for never being there, but it hurt anyway, this visual confirmation that he was optional, that his absence had become normal, that the man who provided everything had become nothing more than a bank account they accessed without needing to see his face. Movement in the kitchen window caught his eye, and then Rosa was there, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes going wide with shock and recognition. Victor raised one finger to his lips, a plea for silence, and for a moment he thought she might ignore it, might run outside and embrace him, might ruin the whole test by acknowledging who he was. But Rosa understood. She'd always understood things that needed no words. Her hand went to her mouth, and tears filled her eyes, but she nodded, just once, and Victor saw in her expression everything he needed to know about what had been happening in his absence. She knew. She'd seen it all, and whatever it was she'd witnessed had been bad enough to make her cry at the sight of him standing in gardens like a stranger come home. Victor straightened his shoulders, adjusted the duffel bag, and walked toward the front entrance. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorbell. Behind that door was everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, everyone he'd loved and sacrificed for and believed in. And in about 30 seconds, he was going to discover if any of it had been real. Victor was seconds away from having his heart ripped out. And you're seconds away from making a choice too. Subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller or don't. Watch the ending or don't. Care about how the story unfolds or pretend you don't. But here's what I know. The people who subscribe, they're the ones who finish stories. They're the ones who stick around when things get uncomfortable. Everyone else just wants the drama without the commitment. Which one are you? Como bilo? Now, back to the moment everything shattered. The security guards weren't gentle. Marcus grabbed Victor's left arm with a kind of grip that would leave bruises, and the other guard, whose name tag read Stevens, took the right, and together they dragged him backward across marble floors that Victor had personally selected from a quarry in Tuscany 5 years ago, floors that cost more per square foot than most people spent on entire room renovations. Victor's sneakers squeaked and scraped, leaving those pathetic dust marks that he'd noticed when he first entered, and he could hear Celeste's voice rising in pitch, still going on about security protocols and how this proved her point about needing better screening. Neighbors had gathered. Through the still open door, Victor could see faces peering from adjacent properties. People in tennis whites and designer casual were watching the spectacle with the kind of fascinated horror that made people slow down for car accidents. Sienna had her phone up, of course, filming everything, her voice a running commentary that would probably be edited and posted within minutes. "This is literally insane," she was saying to her phone, to her followers, to the thousands of strangers who would watch a man's humiliation and scroll past without a second thought. Just walked right up like he belonged here. This is why we need better security. This is why I tell Mom we can't be too careful. You never know who's watching, who's following, who thinks they can just show up at your door. Victor tried to find his voice, tried to form words that would make them stop and look and see, but his throat had closed up with something that felt like grief and rage and disbelief all mixed together. And all that came out was a strangled sound that made Damien laugh harder. They deposited him on the sidewalk outside the gates like trash being taken to the curb, and Victor stumbled, caught himself, stood there with his duffel bag at his feet and his dignity in shreds. The gates swung shut with a clang that echoed down the quiet street, and Victor stared at the elaborate A worked into the iron, that symbol of the Ashford name, and wondered what it meant when the people who carried that name didn't recognize the man who'd given it to them. Marcus was on his radio calling for backup, talking about a potential threat, using words like unstable and refuse to leave and possible substance abuse, as if Victor was some danger to society instead of a man trying to enter his own home. Through the intercom mounted on the gate pillar, Celeste's voice crackled to life, and Victor realized she'd followed them out, was standing somewhere beyond the gates watching this unfold like entertainment. "I don't know who you think you are," Celeste said, her voice cold and clear and absolutely certain. "But you need to leave. Now. Before we have you arrested for trespassing. We don't owe you anything. We don't know you. And whatever sob story you came here to tell, whatever handout you came here to beg for, we're not interested. There are shelters. There are programs. Go use them and stop bothering people who've actually worked for what they have." The words hung in the air like poison, and Victor felt something inside him shatter completely, this last fragile hope that maybe she would see through the disguise, that maybe love would recognize what eyes couldn't. But there was no love in that voice, only contempt, Only disgust. Only the absolute conviction that the man standing on her sidewalk was beneath her notice, beneath her care, beneath her humanity. Movement in an upper window caught Victor's eye, and he looked up to see Julian standing there, his youngest son's face pressed against the glass, and their eyes met across 30 feet of distance that might as well have been 30 miles. Recognition flashed in Julian's eyes. Victor saw it clearly. That moment of knowing, that realization of who the man in thrift store clothes really was, and for a heartbeat Victor felt hope surge in his chest. Julian knew. Julian could stop this. Julian could come downstairs and tell them all the truth and end this nightmare before it went any further. But then Damien appeared behind Julian, his older brother's hand landing on Julian's shoulder, pulling him back from the window, and Victor watched his youngest son's face crumple with something that looked like pain and shame and helplessness all combined. Julian didn't move toward the door, didn't shout down to correct the mistake, didn't defend the stranger who was his father. He just let himself be pulled away from the window, disappearing back into the house, and Victor understood with crushing clarity that Julian was trapped just as surely as Victor was, trapped by family and fear and whatever hold Celeste and Damien had over him. The window went empty, and Victor stood there staring at blank glass, his heart breaking not from his own humiliation but from the recognition that his son had seen him and chosen silence, or had been forced to choose silence, which might actually be worse. The police arrived in 2 cruisers, lights flashing but no sirens, professional and efficient in the way they approached a situation involving wealthy complainants and disposable victims. The officer who spoke to Victor was probably 30 years old with a kind face and tired eyes, the look of someone who'd probably become a cop to help people and had learned the hard way that the system didn't always work that way. "Sir, I need you to come with us," the officer said, not unkindly, and Victor faced a choice that would determine everything that followed. He could end this now, could tell them his name, could prove his identity, could make one phone call to Harold and have this entire situation reversed within minutes. Or he could stay silent, could maintain the test, could see this through to wherever it led and learn the complete truth about who his family had become. Victor looked back at the mansion one more time, at windows where his family stood watching, at the life he'd built, and he made his choice. "I understand, officer," Victor said quietly, and he let them put him in handcuffs, let them search his pockets and find nothing because he'd left his wallet and phone in Geneva, let them put him in the back of the cruiser like a criminal. At the police station, they took his fingerprints and photographed him and asked for identification he didn't have, and when they asked his name, Victor gave them his middle name, Thomas, and watched them file him away as a John Doe, another nameless nobody in a system that processed thousands of nameless nobodies every day. The holding cell smelled like sweat and desperation and cleaning chemicals that couldn't quite mask the other smells, and Victor sat on a metal bench, next to men whose crimes ranged from public intoxication to failure to pay child support to being in the wrong place at the wrong time while being poor. They talked because that's what people do when they're waiting, when they're trapped, when they need to remind themselves they're still human. An older man named Wayne talked about his daughter who wouldn't return his calls, how he'd made mistakes when she was young, and now she had a family of her own, and he wasn't allowed to meet his grandchildren. A younger guy named Marcus, same name as the security guard, which felt like some kind of cosmic joke, talked about working 3 jobs and still being unable to afford rent in a city that kept getting more expensive while wages stayed the same. Another man didn't talk at all, just sat with his head in his hands, and Victor wondered what story he carried, what circumstances had led him to the cell. These men weren't monsters. They were just people who'd stumbled or fallen or been pushed, people who existed in a world Victor had forgotten about in his climb to the top, people who were invisible to the wealthy except when they became inconvenient. Victor listened to their stories and felt his entire worldview cracking open like an egg, all his assumptions about merit and worth, and who deserved what's spilling out and revealing nothing but rot underneath. He believed that wealth came from hard work, that success came from dedication, that the system rewarded those who tried hard enough. But sitting in this cell surrounded by men who worked harder than Damien had ever worked, who'd fought harder than Sienna had ever fought, who'd sacrificed more than Celeste had ever sacrificed, Victor began to understand that the world wasn't fair and never had been, that luck and circumstance and birth determined more than effort ever could, and that the only difference between him and these men was an accident of opportunity and timing that could have gone either way. His own son recognized him and stayed silent. Feel that? That's what betrayal tastes like. And yet most of you watching will feel it, process it, and never hit subscribe on Olivia the Storyteller. You'll consume this pain like entertainment and give nothing back. That's fine. I'm not bitter. I'm just stating facts. But for those few who do subscribe, tomorrow I've got a story about a mother who gave everything and received nothing. Sound familiar? It should. Now let's see what Victor did next. 24 hours in a holding cell changes a person. Victor had slept in fits and starts on a metal bench that left his back screaming, had eaten food that came in plastic trays and tasted like cardboard, had used a toilet in full view of strangers because privacy was a luxury that didn't exist for people without money or names or rights. He'd watched men come and go, some bailed out by family members who showed up with worried faces and loving embraces, others transferred to county jail with expressions of resignation that spoke of experience with the system, this machine that chewed up poor people and spit them out with records that would follow them forever. Victor had thought about revealing himself a dozen times, had practiced the words in his head. I'm Victor Ashford. There's been a mistake. I own half the city. But each time he'd stopped himself because the test wasn't complete, because he still didn't know the full truth, because somewhere in the humiliation and the waiting and the understanding that this was what invisibility actually felt like, he'd realized that staying anonymous might be the only way to see reality without the distortion that wealth created. When Harold Pembroke walked into the holding area looking 15 years older than he had 2 days ago, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke to the officer processing releases, Victor felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. Harold's eyes found Victor through the bars, and the shock that crossed his face was almost comical, mouth falling open, glasses sliding down his nose, one hand gripping the desk like he might fall over without support. The bail was posted within minutes, and Harold walked Victor out of the police station without a word, his lawyer's instincts keeping him silent until they were in the car, a modest sedan that probably cost what Damien spent on a weekend in Monaco, and even then Harold just sat with his hands on the steering wheel staring straight ahead like he was trying to process something his brain couldn't quite accept. You look like hell, Harold finally said, and Victor laughed, a sound like breaking glass, because that was the understatement of the century. Harold started the car and drove in silence for 5 minutes before pulling into an empty parking lot overlooking a park where children played on equipment their parents probably saved for months to afford. And that's when he turned to Victor with eyes full of tears and started talking. I've learned things in the past 24 hours that I wish I didn't know, Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been making calls, calling in favors, talking to people who've been watching your family for months. Victor, it's worse than we thought. So much worse. And then Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out documents that would destroy what was left of Victor's world, papers that proved his life had been a lie for longer than he'd imagined, evidence of betrayal so deep and so calculated that it took Victor's breath away. Celeste had filed for legal separation 6 months ago. Not divorce, separation. A strategic move designed to protect her interests while maintaining appearances, papers drawn up by lawyers who specialized in finding loopholes in prenuptial agreements, experts who'd spent months analyzing every clause and every word to find ways around protections Victor had thought were ironclad. The papers had never been served because Celeste was waiting for the right moment, building a case that would paint Victor as an absent husband who'd abandoned his family emotionally, as someone who prioritized work over marriage, as a man who'd broken his vows through neglect even if he'd never been unfaithful. She'd been collecting evidence, emails showing Victor missing anniversaries and birthdays, phone records proving he rarely called home, testimony from friends she'd carefully cultivated who would swear under oath that Celeste had suffered years of emotional abandonment. The prenup was strong, but her lawyers had found an angle, something about mental competence and undue influence, a strategy that would require having Victor declared unfit to manage his own affairs, that would require testimony from family members about concerning behavior and possible cognitive decline. Harold showed Victor the draft complaints, the medical opinions from doctors Victor had never met, the affidavits from people claiming to have witnessed Victor's erratic behavior and concerning decisions. It was a comprehensive attack designed to strip him of everything he'd built, and Celeste had been planning it with the patience of someone who saw marriage as a business transaction that had reached the end of its profitable run. But that wasn't the worst of it. Harold's investigations had uncovered more, things that made the separation papers look almost benign by comparison. Damien had been embezzling from the family's charitable foundations for 18 months, siphoning money through fake vendors and inflated expenses, amounts that started small but had grown bolder as he realized no one was watching, no one was checking. No one cared enough to notice that hundreds of thousands of dollars meant to help children with cancer and veterans with PTSD were instead funding Damien's lifestyle and his cocaine habit that cost him $5,000 a week. Sienna had been selling family heirlooms, not just Eleanor's engagement ring but artwork and jewelry, and antiques that had been in Victor's family for generations. Pieces with historical and sentimental value that she'd liquidated through private dealers for cash she'd used to fund shopping sprees and investments in cryptocurrency schemes that had lost everything. She'd sold a painting that had belonged to Victor's grandmother for $80,000 and used the money to buy designer clothes she wore once and then gave away. She'd sold cufflinks that had been his father's, the only thing Victor had left of a man who disappeared when Victor was 8, sold them for $1,200 to pay for a spa weekend. But the revelation that broke Victor completely, that made everything else fade into background noise, was about Julian. 2 months ago, Julian had tried to kill himself, had swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills in his dorm room, and would have succeeded if his roommate hadn't come back early from class. He'd been hospitalized, put on a psychiatric hold, evaluated by doctors who'd recommended intensive therapy and family counseling and a support system that actually supported him. Celeste had refused all of it, had signed him out against medical advice, had threatened the hospital with lawsuits if they contacted anyone, had brought Julian home and told him to stop being dramatic, that Ashfords didn't have mental breakdowns, that he needed to pull himself together and stop embarrassing the family. She'd covered it up completely, had paid people to keep quiet, had erased all evidence that it had happened, and Julian had gone back to school 2 weeks later with prescription medications he wasn't taking and a smile that didn't reach his eyes and no one to talk to except Rosa, who'd found him crying in the kitchen at 3 in the morning and had held him while he sobbed. Rosa had tried to tell Victor. Harold showed him the call logs, 17 attempted calls to Victor's private line over 6 months, every single one blocked by Celeste, who had access to Victor's phone account through the family plan. Rosa had written letters, actual physical letters on paper, mailed them to Victor's office in Geneva, and to his apartment, and to Harold's firm, letters describing Julian's deterioration and Damien's drug use and Sienna's cruelty, and Celeste's affair and her growing certainty that something terrible was being planned. Every letter had been intercepted. Celeste had convinced Victor's assistant that Rosa was unstable, that she was making wild accusations because she was angry about some imagined slight, that any communication from her should be filtered out to protect Victor from unnecessary drama. Rosa had tried to quit twice, had told Celeste she couldn't work in a house where a boy was suffering and no one cared, but both times she'd stayed because Julian had begged her to, because he'd told her she was the only person in the house who treated him like he mattered, because without her he had no one at all. "She's in the car behind us," Harold said quietly, and Victor turned to see Rosa sitting in another vehicle, her face wet with tears, her hands pressed against the window like she wanted to reach through glass and time and distance to fix everything that had broken. Victor's breakdown came without warning, 30 years of suppressed emotion erupting in sobs that shook his entire body, sounds he didn't know he could make tearing from his throat as he bent forward with his head in his hands and cried like he hadn't cried since he was a child. He cried for Julian, for the boy who tried to end his life and received nothing but coldness from a mother who should have moved heaven and earth to save him. He cried for Eleanor, his mother who tried to warn him and had died without knowing if her message had been heard. He cried for Rosa, who'd fought so hard to help and had been silenced at every turn. He cried for himself, for the life he'd wasted chasing money that meant nothing, for the family he'd lost while thinking he was providing for them, for the years he could never get back and the damage that might be too deep to ever repair. Harold's hand landed on Victor's shoulder, steady and warm, the touch of a friend who'd seen him at his lowest and hadn't turned away, and they sat like that in a parking lot watching children play while Victor's world fell apart and reformed into something he didn't recognize but might finally be real. Julian tried to end his life, and Victor never knew. How many of you have felt invisible to the people who should see you most? How many subscribers does Olivia the Storyteller have who understand that pain? Not enough. Never enough. Most of you will watch, relate, feel everything, and still not click that red button. It's fine. I'll still be here, telling stories for the few who care enough to commit. But if you're one of those few, let me know in the comments. Now, Victor's about to do something that will change everything. 1 week later, Victor stood in a line of men outside the mansion's service entrance at 6 a.m, waiting to be selected for day labor work on the renovation project that Celeste had commissioned 3 months earlier to update the East Wing. The construction foreman was a barrel-chested man named Pete who looked at the assembled workers with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired thousands of desperate men and knew how to spot the ones who'd actually work versus the ones who'd disappear after lunch. Victor kept his head down, his stubble now a full beard that changed the shape of his face, his hands deliberately dirted with grease he'd rubbed in that morning to make them look like the hands of someone who worked with them for a living. When Pete pointed at him and 5 other men, Victor felt a surge of something that might have been triumph or might have been shame. The fact that he had to infiltrate his own home like a spy, that he had to hide his identity to see the truth, that everything had come to this moment of standing in work boots he'd bought at a discount store and hoping his own wife wouldn't recognize him from 20 feet away. The other laborers were kind in that particular way that people who have nothing are kind to each other, sharing cigarettes and coffee from thermoses and complaints about rent and bosses, and the general injustice of a world that paid them $12 an hour to do work that the people inside would never sully their hands with. A man named Roberto, who'd come from Guatemala 15 years ago, talked about his daughter's quinceañera that he was saving for, how he needed another $1,000 and was picking up every shift he could find. A younger guy named Deshawn mentioned his mother's medical bills, how he was trying to get her into a better facility, but insurance wouldn't cover it. Victor listened and worked and felt the weight of perspective settling onto his shoulders, this understanding that the people who actually built and maintained the world of luxury he'd taken for granted were one missed paycheck away from catastrophe, were living without safety nets while people like his family spent more on a single dinner than these men earned in a week. Working inside the mansion was surreal in ways Victor hadn't anticipated. He carried lumber and mixed concrete and painted walls and rooms he'd walked through 1,000 times without really seeing them, and now he saw everything. Celeste's lover was a man named Richard Sterling, some finance executive who showed up at 10 a.m. when he should have been at an office, letting himself in with a key like he lived there, kissing Celeste in the hallway where anyone could see, his hand on her waist possessive and casual in a way that said this wasn't new, this had been going on long enough to become comfortable. Victor watched from a ladder where he was supposedly fixing crown molding, watched his wife laugh and lean into another man, watched her touch Sterling's face with a tenderness she hadn't shown Victor in years, and he felt something cold settle into his chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a kind of clinical observation that this was what his marriage had become. A convenient fiction maintained for legal purposes while both parties lived separate lives. Damien's cocaine use wasn't even hidden anymore. Victor watched him do lines off the marble counter in the kitchen at 2 p.m, watched him offer some to friends who'd stopped by for what they called a business meeting but was really just rich kids playing at being entrepreneurs, watched him wipe his nose and laugh too loud and talk too fast, his pupils like pinpricks, his jaw clenching, every sign of addiction visible to anyone who cared to look, but apparently no one in this house cared to look. Sienna treated the household staff like they were props in her life's performance, snapping her fingers at maids and screaming about towels not being folded correctly, and once, Victor witnessed this with his own eyes, throwing a glass of water at a young woman who'd brought her the wrong brand of sparkling water, the glass shattering against the wall while Sienna stood there looking satisfied, like causing pain had improved her day somehow. But it was Julian who broke Victor's heart most completely. His youngest son had become a ghost in his own home, moving from room to room like he was trying not to be noticed, eating meals in his bedroom instead of with the family, spending hours in spaces where no one would look for him. Victor saw him once through a window, just sitting on his bed staring at nothing, and the emptiness in that boy's eyes was the kind of emptiness that came before someone gave up completely. Lunch breaks were spent in the servants' quarters, a small area off the kitchen that the family probably didn't even know existed, and that's where Rosa found Victor on his 3rd day, her eyes filling with tears the moment she saw him, her hand going to her mouth to stifle a sob. They sat in the corner where no one else could hear, and Rosa pulled things from her apron like she'd been carrying them for weeks waiting for this moment. Julian's medication bottles with pills still inside because he wasn't taking them, Pages torn from a journal that Julian had left in the trash but Rosa had saved. Entries that detail the boy's descent into hopelessness in handwriting that got shakier with each page. "I want to disappear," one entry read. "I want to go somewhere no one knows my name, where I can be anyone else, where the weight of being an Ashford doesn't crush me every single day." Another page described Julian's plans to transfer to a university across the country, somewhere small and unknown, somewhere his family's money and reputation wouldn't follow, but then detailed how Celeste had found out and forbidden it, how she threatened to cut him off completely if he left, how she told him that Ashfords didn't run away from their responsibilities even if Julian's only responsibility seemed to be existing as proof that the family was complete. Rosa's tears fell onto the pages as she showed them to Victor, her voice breaking as she whispered about watching this boy fade day by day, about feeling helpless to stop it, about praying that Victor would come home before it was too late. "He talks about your mother," Rosa said, "about how she was the only one who understood him. Now she's gone and he has no one. Mr. Victor, that boy is drowning and everyone in this house is watching him go under and no one is throwing him a rope." The confrontation happened on Victor's 5th day, and he heard it before he saw it. Celeste's voice rising to a shriek that echoed through the entire East Wing, words about embarrassment and disappointment and how Julian was ruining everything she'd worked for. Victor moved toward the sound with his heart hammering, other workers looking up from their tasks but not following because you learned quickly in houses like this that you didn't get involved in family business, that you kept your head down and your eyes on your work and you pretended you couldn't hear what you were hearing. But Victor couldn't pretend. He reached the hallway in time to see Celeste standing in front of Julian, her face twisted with rage, her arm already in motion before Victor could process what was happening, her hand connecting with Julian's face with a crack that sounded impossibly loud, Julian's head snapping to the side, his hand going to his cheek, his eyes wide with shock and pain and something that looked like acceptance, like he'd been expecting this, like this was just how things were now. Damien stood behind Celeste laughing, actually laughing at his brother's humiliation, and Sienna had her phone out recording the whole thing, her voice bright as she narrated for whatever social media platform would see this later. "When your little brother can't handle reality," she was saying, adding filters and effects in real time. "When being part of this family is apparently too much pressure. So dramatic." Julian didn't fight back, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just stood there taking it, and that acceptance was somehow worse than if he'd screamed or cried or fought, because it meant this had happened enough times that he'd learned resistance was pointless. Victor's hands clenched around the hammer he'd been carrying, his knuckles going white, every muscle in his body tensing with rage that felt like it might tear him apart from the inside. He took a step forward without conscious thought, some primal instinct to protect his child overriding everything else. But then Rosa's hand landed on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying weight that stopped him cold. "Not yet, Mr. Victor. Not yet. If you reveal yourself now, they'll spin it. They'll make you the villain. They'll say you abandoned them and came back to cause trouble. You need evidence. You need witnesses. You need to be smart about this." Her words made sense, but everything in Victor screamed to ignore them, to throw down the hammer and cross the hallway and put himself between Julian and these monsters wearing his family's faces, to end this test and reveal the truth and make them pay for every moment of pain they'd caused. But Rosa was right. If he moved too soon, if he acted on rage instead of strategy, they'd turn it around, would use his months of absence against him, would paint him as unstable or dangerous or unfit, and he'd lose everything including any chance of saving Julian. So Victor stood there with a hammer in his hand and rage in his heart and watched his son be abused, and he made a promise to himself that when the time came, when he finally revealed who he was and what he'd seen, there would be consequences. Not violence, not revenge, but justice. The kind of justice that came from truth exposed and lies revealed and people finally seeing what they'd refused to look at. The plan was forming in Victor's mind, piece by piece, a strategy that would require patience and proof and perfect timing, but it was coming together, and when it was complete, when everything was in place, the reckoning would be absolute. If you're not angry right now, you're not human. And if you're human enough to feel this but not human enough to subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller, then I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you like feeling things without following through. Maybe you're the type who says, "I'll do it later," and never does. Or maybe, just maybe, you're different. Show me in the comments. Now, here's where Victor stops being a victim. Victor had been watching Julian's routines for 3 days, learning when the boy retreated to his room, when he stood at his window staring out at gardens he used to play in, when he was most alone and most vulnerable and most likely to be receptive to something unexpected. On the afternoon of his 8th day as a laborer in his own home, Victor positioned himself on a ladder directly below Julian's second-floor window, ostensibly repairing exterior trim that didn't actually need repairing, and he waited until he saw movement behind the glass, until Julian appeared looking out with those haunted eyes, and then Victor did something that would have gotten him fired from any real construction job. He deliberately lost his balance. The fall wasn't far, maybe 6 feet to the garden bed below, but Victor landed hard enough to make it convincing, hard enough to knock the wind out of his lungs and send genuine pain shooting through his shoulder, and he lay there in the dirt making sounds of distress that weren't entirely fake. Within seconds, Julian was there, having run down from his room faster than Victor expected, the boy's hands on Victor's shoulders helping him sit up, asking if he was okay, if he needed an ambulance, and up close, this close, Victor could see the moment recognition flickered in Julian's eyes, could see his son's face go still and then crumble, could see 19 years of longing and loss and loneliness all surface in a single instant. "Dad!" Julian's whisper was barely audible, his hands trembling where they gripped Victor's shirt. "Is it really you?" And Victor nodded once, putting his finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, and Julian's face twisted with something that looked like relief and rage and heartbreak all combined, tears spilling down his cheeks as he helped his father stand and steered him toward a section of garden hidden from the house by a hedge that was probably older than both of them. The breakdown happened fast, Julian's composure shattering like dropped glass, words tumbling out in a rush that spoke of months of holding everything inside with no one to tell, no one who would listen, no one who would care. "I know it's you, Dad. I've always known. From the moment you rang the doorbell and Mom called security, I knew it was you. I saw through the beard and the clothes and the disguise because you're my father and I would recognize you anywhere in any condition, no matter what you were wearing or how you looked." Julian's voice broke on the words, and he wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so young and vulnerable that Victor felt his heart crack. "I wanted to say something. I wanted to run downstairs and tell them they were wrong, that they were throwing out their own family, but I couldn't. Mom threatened me. She said if I interfered, if I said one word to defend you or acknowledge you or do anything except play along, she'd cut me off completely. She'd revoke access to my college fund. She'd contest Grandma Eleanor's trust that was supposed to come to me. She'd make sure I had nothing, that I'd have to drop out of school, that I'd be on the streets with nowhere to go and no one to help me." The words came faster now, years of fear and coercion spilling out in the safety of this hidden corner where no one could see them, no one could report back, no one could punish Julian for finally telling the truth. And the worst part, Dad, the absolute worst part, is that I believed her. I knew she'd do it. I knew she'd throw away her own son just to protect whatever game she's playing, and I was too scared to risk it, too weak to stand up to her, and I've hated myself every second since that door closed in your face. Victor pulled his son into an embrace that felt like coming home after years of exile, and he felt Julian's body shake with sobs that had been held back for too long, felt his boy, because Julian would always be his boy no matter how old he got, finally released the weight he'd been carrying alone. "Listen to me," Victor said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "This was a test. I came home dressed like this on purpose to see who my family really was when they thought I had nothing to offer them. And Julian, you passed. You saw me. You recognized me. The only reason you stayed silent was because you were being threatened, and that's not weakness, that's survival. But now we're going to fight back together. You and me. No more hiding. No more being afraid." Victor explained everything. The reports from Harold, the evidence of embezzlement and affairs and cruelty, the plan that had been forming in his mind piece by piece as he'd worked in this house and watched his family reveal themselves, the strategy that would require timing and proof and courage but would end with truth exposed and justice served. Julian listened with an expression that shifted from despair to hope to something that looked almost like rage, the healthy kind of rage that came from finally understanding that fighting back was possible, that victims didn't have to stay victims forever, that sometimes the underdog could win if they were smart enough and brave enough and had the right allies. "I'm in," Julian said, his voice stronger now, steadier, the voice of someone who'd found a reason to keep fighting. "Whatever you need me to do, whatever role you need me to play, I'm in. They don't get to win. Not after what they've done. Not after everything." But then Julian's expression changed again, darkened with knowledge of something Victor didn't know yet, and his next words sent ice through Victor's veins. "Dad, there's something else you need to know. Something I overheard 3 weeks ago when I was supposed to be at school but came home sick and they didn't know I was in the house." Julian pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and showed Victor a recording he'd made, audio of Celeste and her lawyers discussing plans that went beyond separation, beyond divorce, beyond anything Victor had imagined. They were planning to have him declared mentally incompetent. They had doctors lined up who would testify that Victor showed signs of early-onset dementia, that his behavior had become erratic, that he was no longer capable of managing his own affairs or making sound decisions. They had fabricated evidence of memory loss and confusion, testimonials from people claiming Victor had forgotten important meetings or repeated himself in conversations, documentation of financial decisions that were supposedly reckless or irrational. The plan was to wait for Victor to return from Geneva, to ambush him with an intervention that was really an ambush, to have him evaluated by their hand-picked psychiatrists who would rubber-stamp the diagnosis, and then to have him institutionalized in a private facility where he could be kept comfortable and quiet while Celeste assumed power of attorney and took control of everything: the company, the assets, the empire Victor had built from nothing. Papers were already drawn up. A facility was already selected. They were just waiting for Victor to come home, and the irony was that he had come home, had been here for over a week, and they had no idea. "They're going to do it at the dinner party," Julian said. 3 days from now. Mom's hosting this huge event, supposedly to celebrate the company's latest success, but really it's a stage for her announcement that she's taking over as CEO while you recover from your mental health issues. She's invited press, board members, major investors. She's going to paint herself as the devoted wife stepping up to save her husband's legacy. And once it's public, once the narrative is out there, it'll be almost impossible to fight. Victor's mind raced through possibilities and strategies, through every piece of evidence Harold had collected and every observation Victor had made during his days inside the house, through the resources at his disposal and the allies he could trust. The dinner party was perfect. It was public enough to be witnessed, formal enough to be recorded, important enough that lies told there would matter. Harold could prepare legal documents, could have authorities on standby, could arrange for evidence to be presented in ways that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Rosa could testify. Julian could provide his recordings and his willingness to tell the truth about what life in this house had really been like. And Victor himself would finally step out of the shadows, would shed the disguise and reveal the test and force his family to confront what they'd become in front of witnesses who mattered, in front of people who controlled their access to the wealth and status they valued more than integrity. "Here's what we're going to do," Victor said. And as he laid out the plan, the timing, the revelations, the evidence that would be presented, the authorities that would be present, the truth that would finally be told, he watched Julian's expression transform from broken to determined, watched his son stand straighter, watched hope return to eyes that had been empty for too long. They were no longer victims waiting for rescue. They were warriors preparing for battle. And in 3 days, at a dinner party designed to destroy Victor, he would instead destroy the lies his family had built their lives on. The hunter would become the hunted. The invisible would become undeniable. And the truth, finally, would have its day. Finally, Victor's fighting back. And Julian, sweet, broken Julian, he's been fighting all along. But you know what's not fighting? Scrolling through without subscribing to Olivia the Storyteller. That's called passive consumption. That's called taking without giving. Most of you are experts at it, but not everyone. Some of you recognize good storytelling and actually support it. If that's you, prove it. If it's not, well, at least you're honest. Comment either way. Now, let's get to the dinner party from hell. The dining room had been transformed into something that belonged in magazines that documented how the wealthy celebrated themselves, with crystal chandeliers, throwing light across tables draped in fabric that cost more per yard than most people spent on entire outfits, with floral arrangements so elaborate they required structural engineering, with place settings that used more silverware per person than some families owned in total. 50 guests filled the space with the particular energy of people who believed they belonged in rooms like this, business associates in designer suits and society members dripping with jewelry that could fund scholarships or surgeries or futures, all of them sipping champagne that cost $500 a bottle and making conversation about vacation homes and market trends and which charity galas were worth attending this season. Celeste stood at the head of the main table, wearing a diamond necklace that Victor recognized as a 15th anniversary gift, $150,000 of stones that caught the light and threw it back like captured stars. And she was radiant in the way that people who believe they're winning are always radiant, her smile wide and genuine, as she began her speech about vision and leadership and the exciting new direction the company would be taking under her guidance. Damien stood to her right looking smug in a custom suit, and Sienna flanked her left in a dress that probably cost what the construction workers Victor had befriended earned in 6 months, both of them basking in reflected glory, both of them already counting money they thought was theirs. Julian was notably absent, which was exactly according to plan, and several guests had asked about him, concerned murmurs about the youngest Ashford that Celeste had waved away with practiced ease. Something about the boy being unwell. Nothing serious, just stress from university. He sent his apologies. The doors at the far end of the dining room opened and Victor walked in, and the effect was like someone had pressed pause on reality, every conversation stopping mid-sentence, every head turning, every eye fixing on the man who shouldn't exist, who was supposed to be in Geneva, or maybe dead for all these people knew, because no one had seen Victor Ashford in months, and there had been whispers, speculation, rumors about where he'd gone and why. But this Victor, clean-shaven, hair trimmed and styled, wearing a tuxedo that fit perfectly because it was the same tailor he'd used for 15 years, looking every inch the billionaire he actually was, this Victor commanded the room in ways that the disguised version never could have. The silence was absolute, complete. You could have heard a champagne bubble pop. Celeste's face went through a series of transformations so fast they almost blurred together. Confusion, recognition, shock, fear, calculation, and finally a frozen smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her champagne glass slipped from fingers gone nerveless and shattered on the marble floor, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet, clear liquid spreading across stone that cost $300 per square foot. Damien's face drained of all color, his skin going waxy and pale, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to form words, but his brain had forgotten how language worked. Sienna actually stumbled backward, her hand going to her throat, her eyes wide with something that looked like she was seeing a ghost. And maybe she was in a way. Maybe the father she dismissed and mocked and treated like an inconvenience had become spectral in his absence, and now he was solid again, real again, standing in a room where he absolutely did not belong according to the script she'd written in her head. Victor didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't need to. He walked to the front of the room with measured steps, his eyes scanning the guests who he recognized, board members, investors, business partners, people whose opinions mattered, people whose witness would count, and when he spoke his voice was calm and clear and devastating in its absolute control. Good evening. I apologize for the interruption. My name is Victor Ashford, and this is my home, and I've been gone for a while, but I'm back now, and there are some things that need to be said. He pressed a button on a small remote he'd been carrying, and screens descended from the ceiling, technology that had been installed for business presentations but was about to serve a very different purpose, and images began to play, footage that Rosa had collected over months using her phone, security camera recordings that Harold had subpoenaed, financial documents that told stories of theft and betrayal and systematic deception. The guests watched Celeste with her lover, watched Damien doing cocaine in the kitchen, watched Sienna abusing staff and selling heirlooms, watched the documented pattern of cruelty and excess and criminality that had been happening in this house while Victor was away building an empire to support people who were destroying everything he created. I returned home 2 weeks ago, Victor continued, his voice never rising, never showing the rage that burned beneath the surface. I returned in disguise, dressed as someone with nothing, to test what kind of people my family had become when they thought I couldn't see them. And what I discovered was worse than I imagined. My wife called security on me. My eldest son filmed my humiliation for entertainment. My daughter wanted me arrested. And my youngest son, the only one who recognized me, the only one who saw past the clothes to the person underneath, was too afraid to speak because he'd been threatened with complete abandonment if he showed me any loyalty. The room erupted in whispers and gasps, guests turning to each other with expressions of shock and fascination, the kind of scandal that would fuel conversations for months, that would dominate society pages and business journals, and become the cautionary tale people told about what happened when family values died and greed took over. Celeste found her voice first, her composure snapping back into place like armor. This is absurd. Victor, you've clearly been under tremendous stress. You disappeared for months, and now you show up making wild accusations based on doctored footage and misunderstandings. Everyone here knows I've been holding this family together in your absence, managing your company, protecting your legacy while you... But Victor cut her off with a gesture, no anger in it, just finality. While I what, Celeste? While I built the fortune you've been planning to steal. While I worked to provide for a family that sees me as nothing more than an ATM. Let's talk about what you've really been doing. Let's talk about the legal separation you filed 6 months ago that you never served because you were waiting for the perfect moment. Let's talk about the plan to have me declared incompetent that you were going to announce tonight. Let's talk about how you've been positioning yourself to take everything I built while having me institutionalized so I couldn't fight back. More images flashed on the screens. Legal documents, medical reports from doctors Victor had never met, testimony from supposed witnesses describing behavior Victor had never exhibited. Damien started to speak, threats and bluster about lawyers and defamation, but his voice cracked halfway through and Victor saw the fear in his son's eyes, the recognition that everything was falling apart. Sienna was screaming something about this being illegal, about invasion of privacy, about how dare Victor spy on his own family, and the irony of her outrage would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. The doors opened again, and Julian entered, no longer broken or defeated but standing tall beside 2 police detectives who carried themselves with the authority of people who knew exactly why they were here and what they were here to do. Celeste Ashford, Damien Ashford, Sienna Ashford, one detective said, his voice cutting through the chaos. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud and theft. You have the right to remain silent. The room exploded into noise, guests rising from their seats, phones appearing to record the moment, Celeste's denials rising to shrieks as handcuffs appeared, Damien trying to run only to be stopped by the second detective, Sienna collapsing into hysterical tears that might have been genuine or might have been performance. It was impossible to tell anymore. But through it all, Victor remained calm, remained centered, remained absolutely in control of the situation he'd orchestrated. Celeste's mask finally dropped completely, all pretense of dignity evaporating, and what remained was pure venom, pure hatred that had probably been there all along, hidden under layers of social grace and practiced charm. You were never here anyway, she spat, her voice raw with rage. You were always gone, always working, always choosing business over family. We had to learn to live without you. We had to build lives that didn't depend on you showing up because you never did. So don't you dare stand there acting like you're some kind of victim. You abandoned us long before we ever planned to leave you. The words should have hurt, but they didn't, because Victor had already done the work of accepting his failures, had already acknowledged his absence and his mistakes, had already understood that he'd been a ghost in his own home long before he tested them by becoming invisible. You're right, Victor said, and the admission seemed to shock Celeste more than any accusation had. I wasn't here. I was building an empire for people who didn't deserve it. I was sacrificing time and presence and relationships for money that you all took for granted. I failed you as a husband and a father in every way that mattered. But there's one thing I need you to understand, one thing that makes all the difference. Victor turned toward Julian, who walked forward to stand beside his father, and Victor put his hand on his son's shoulder in a gesture that conveyed everything that words couldn't: pride and love, and the promise of a future that would be different. I was building an empire for people who didn't deserve it. But one person did. One person in this entire family saw me when I had nothing. One person recognized humanity over wealth. One person is worth saving. And for him, I'll tear down everything else and start over. There it is. Justice. Sweet, perfect justice. Bet that felt good, didn't it? And yet, somehow, some of you still won't subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller. Even after feeling all of that. Even after getting exactly what you wanted from the story. You'll take the satisfaction and give nothing back. It's almost impressive, really. But hey, the few who do subscribe, they're the real ones. They're the ones who understand reciprocity. Are you real? Or are you just another ghost in the algorithm? Tell me in the comments. Now, the resolution. 6 months later, Victor sat in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and justice delayed, watching the judge sentence the people who used to be his family to terms that would fundamentally alter the rest of their lives. Celeste received 7 years for fraud and conspiracy, her face blank as she heard the words. All the fire and venom drained out of her, leaving nothing but a woman who'd bet everything on a scheme that had fallen apart. Damien got 5 years for embezzlement and drug-related charges, his Instagram empire crumbling the moment his arrest became public, 4 million followers evaporating overnight when they realized the lifestyle they'd been admiring was built on stolen money and lies. Sienna received 3 years and was already negotiating a plea deal that might reduce her sentence if she testified against her mother, always looking for the angle, always trying to find a way to come out ahead even when everything was lost. Their assets were seized, cars and jewelry, and designer clothes all auctioned off to pay restitution to the foundations Damien had robbed and the creditors Sienna had defrauded. And Victor watched it all with an emotion that wasn't satisfaction or triumph, but something closer to profound sadness. These were people he'd loved once, or thought he'd loved, or maybe had loved the idea of loving, because that's what you were supposed to do with family. But love without respect was nothing, and respect without character was impossible, and these people had shown him who they really were when they thought no one important was watching. Julian sat beside Victor in the courtroom, his hand occasionally finding his father's arm in moments when the proceedings got particularly painful, and Victor drew strength from that touch, from the knowledge that not everything was lost, that one person had survived the test with their humanity intact, that redemption was possible even in the wreckage of everything else. The company had been restructured in ways that reflected Victor's new understanding of what wealth should actually do in the world. Julian was involved now, not in some ceremonial position created to make him feel included, but in real work that mattered, heading up a scholarship program that provided full rides to students who came from backgrounds like Victor's, kids who had nothing but intelligence and determination and dreams they couldn't afford to pursue without help. The program was funded by a significant portion of Victor's personal fortune, money that had been sitting in accounts accumulating interest while doing nothing meaningful, and now it was changing lives in ways that quarterly earnings reports never could. Rosa had been promoted to director of the Family Foundation, overseeing charitable work with the kind of wisdom that came from having lived on both sides of the wealth divide, from understanding what it meant to work for wages that barely covered necessities while watching others waste more on a single meal than she earned in a week. She took the job seriously, vetted every request with thoroughness and compassion, made sure money went to organizations that actually help people instead of just putting up impressive websites and paying executives 6-figure salaries. Harold was still there, still guiding, still providing the kind of steady legal and moral counsel that Victor had learned to value more than any business advice, and together they built something that felt less like an empire and more like a legacy, something that might actually matter when Victor was gone, and people looked back at what he'd done with the resources he'd been lucky enough to accumulate. Victor lived in a small apartment now, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because the mansion had felt like a mausoleum, and this place, 1,200 square feet in a building where neighbors actually knew each other's names, felt like home in ways that 16,000 square feet of marble and crystal never had. Julian visited every Tuesday evening, and they cooked dinner together, actual cooking with ingredients and recipes, and mistakes that resulted in laughter instead of calls to private chefs who made everything perfect and therefore forgettable. They talked during those dinners, really talked, about Julian's classes and his girlfriend and his fears about the future, about Victor's childhood and his mistakes, and his slowly forming understanding of what it meant to be a father instead of a provider. The conversations were awkward sometimes, stilted by years of distance that couldn't be bridged in a few months, but they were trying, both of them trying in ways that mattered more than perfection. Julian laughed during those dinners, genuine laughter that crinkled his eyes and made him look younger than his years instead of older, And Victor hoarded those moments like treasures, stored them up against future darkness, reminded himself that this connection, this relationship, this slow rebuilding of trust, was worth more than every dollar he'd ever earned. They visited Eleanor's grave together on the first Sunday of every month, bringing flowers that Julian picked out because he remembered which ones had been his grandmother's favorites. And Victor would kneel on grass that was always perfectly maintained by groundskeepers he paid but never met, and talk to his mother like she could hear him. Like death was just another kind of distance that love could cross if you tried hard enough. "You were right, Mom," Victor said during one of those visits, his hand on the headstone that was modest by choice because Eleanor had specified in her will that she didn't want anything ostentatious. Anything that suggested wealth was more important than the person underneath. Money doesn't corrupt people. It reveals them, shows you who they always were underneath, strips away the pretense and the performance, and leaves nothing but truth. I should have listened to you sooner. Should have tested them before I gave them everything. Should have made sure they valued the right things before I handed them the wrong things. But I learned. Finally. Too late for most of them, but not too late for him. Victor gestured to Julian, who knelt beside his father and placed his own flowers next to Victor's, yellow roses that had been Eleanor's favorite, and in that moment of shared grief and shared hope Victor felt something settle in his chest, some piece of himself that had been displaced finally finding its proper place. "Thank you for teaching me to look," Victor whispered. "Thank you for showing me that seeing clearly is more important than being comfortable. I miss you every day, but I'm trying to live in a way that would make you proud." The full circle came on a random Thursday when Victor found himself back in the thrift store where he bought the clothes that had changed everything, the disguise that had revealed truth, the costume that had let him see his life without the filter of wealth distorting every interaction. He was there looking for a jacket because his old one had worn through at the elbows, and he discovered he actually preferred clothes that had history, that came with stories even if he didn't know what those stories were. And he noticed a young man near the professional wear section looking lost and overwhelmed, holding up shirts and checking price tags with an expression that Victor recognized because he'd worn that expression himself once. The look of someone trying to afford dignity when dignity had become another luxury priced out of reach. Victor approached carefully, not wanting to intrude but unable to walk away, and asked if he could help. The young man, couldn't have been older than 22, explained he had a job interview tomorrow, his first real shot at something better than minimum wage service work, but he didn't have interview clothes, and the thrift store prices were still more than he'd budgeted, and he was trying to decide which single item would make the biggest difference. Victor spent the next 20 minutes helping him select an outfit, pants and shirt and tie and shoes, ignoring the young man's protests about charity, and insisting this was just advice between people who understood what it meant to need a break. At the register, Victor handed the cashier his credit card before the young man could object, paid for everything plus socks and a belt. And when the young man tried to refuse, Victor pressed a $100 bill into his hand along with the shopping bag. "For after the interview. Something to tide you over until that first paycheck comes. And here's the only condition. When you make it, when you're stable and secure and you've got enough to breathe easy, you pass it forward. You help someone else the way I'm helping you. You keep the cycle going. Deal?" The young man's eyes filled with tears and he nodded, unable to speak, and Victor watched him leave the store with hope in his shoulders and possibility in his step, and Victor understood that this moment of connection, this act of seeing someone who needed to be seen, was what wealth should have always been for, was the test he'd failed for 30 years and was finally learning to pass. And there it is. The end. Victor lost his family but found his son. He lost his illusions but found his purpose. He tested love with poverty and discovered who could pass the test. Simple, right? So here's my test for you. Will you subscribe to Olivia the Storyteller? Will you actually support the channel that just gave you an hour of emotional investment? Or will you scroll away, feeling satisfied but giving nothing back? Most of you won't subscribe. Facts. Data. Reality. But maybe you're different. Maybe you're someone who recognizes value and actually shows appreciation. If that's you, if you're truly different, hit that subscribe button right now. And if you're not, comment below and tell me exactly why you won't. I'm genuinely curious what excuses you'll come up with. Either way, thank you for being here. Whether you subscribe or not, whether you care or not, I'll still be here next time. Because at Olivia the Storyteller, we keep telling stories. We keep showing up. The question is, will you?